What makes a country a democracy? I look forward to seeing your answers online. I mean, for me, when I try to think of what goes into how can you visualize a democracy, the first thing that comes up for me is an election, right? People's voice being heard in deciding who is going to lead their national, local, or state or province government. And the evolution of these systems can have a path dependency to it, right? Which makes me think of pinball growing up when I was a kid back in the 19th century, or pachinko. This is an old picture of a pachinko game in which you have balls dropping from above, and due to chance, due to parts of how the game was designed, where the different pegs are placed, balls can go in one direction or another and land more or less towards one side or another in one position or another, right? That there is a sense of randomness to it, and history, design, structural design plays a role, but then also you can rattle the game. Pinball machines are probably easier to rattle than a pachinko game, but you can have some effect on it in some small part to kind of jiggle it one way or another, right? But I mean, we're trying to look for something a little bit more rigorous than trying to bang on a game and try to have an effect on it. So, several characteristics of a democratic system that are relevant for this class in our discussion of political institutions and how they affect conflict. Constitutions, we already discussed before, that government's ultimate legitimacy and authority derive from the written document that outlines the power that different political institutions have. Representative government, that direct democracy might be applicable in a couple of small cantons in Switzerland or in ancient Athens if you're a white male landowner or whatever. But most of all, we choose representatives to go to the seat of government, wherever that might be, and represent the interests of the larger population that selected them to go and govern. Separation of powers is also an enduring issue when it comes to democratic governance. A lot of the power in constitutional systems are separated into multiple different branches. It depends on if you're a presidential or parliamentary system, of course, in how separate the executive and the legislative powers are divided, but there's usually a separate judicial branch that hears and decides whether certain activities by one branch of government or another are within their realm, and individuals can petition their government, to petition the court to hear their case if they don't feel the government is representing their interests, which links to the judicial and legal rights that both different branches of power have, as well as individuals in written down form as to what people's responsibilities and rights are. And if those rights are violated by the government, they can seek redress through the judicial or legal systems. And the last element that we see mentioned as a fundamental aspect of democracy is individual participation, that we all participate in democracy either through the ballot box or by hitting the streets, or to try to advocate through the legal system or the media or other areas to put pressure on the government, that individuals participate in their political system to advocate for themselves as well as sharing information about what the costs and benefits of different policies are, to help make others within the polis decide that your case might hold merit and there might be some negotiated settlement, or the representatives have a better understanding as to what the costs and benefits of different activities are. So here are a few characteristics of a democratic system that don't really focus on elections, but are in a lot of ways related to it. there are a lot of different ways of measuring to the extent to which countries live up to different ideals of democracy. I'd like to talk a little bit about a couple of different data sources that are the most common in the political science literature, because they involve a lot of stated and unstated assumptions. A lot of political scientists who use these data on a day-to-day basis don't really understand how the sausage is made. They don't really look into the sub level of the different measures that are aggregated into overall measures. Here, for example, is a measure of institutionalized democracy from the Polity project, which we've already covered so far in this class. You might have seen in your other classes. And it includes four main factors that go into whether a country is considered an institutionalized democracy. How competitive executive recruitment is, either the president or the head of the governing party in a parliamentary system. Is it through an election or some transitional process after the end of a conflict, or transitioning to a new political system? How open it is for executive recruitment through the election process. And then competitiveness of political participation also comes into it. But I think when institutionalized democracy, one of the most important parts is the third, which is the constraints on the chief executive. That, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the main puzzle and dilemmas in the study of political systems is that people leave the state of nature and give up their rights, often sometimes to their freedoms, in exchange for other freedoms of property or security. That there is some consequences if people do violate other people's security. So how constrained the chief executive is in some ways how much the executive can act on a whim in order to try to grab the powers from other groups, or how constrained they are through legal processes or through the separation of powers, is an important part of institutionalized democracy. The executive can't do what they want, not just necessarily always one person, but the executive institutions of it. And I think there's a lot of differences in people's views of what makes a democracy, how satisfied people are of democracy. Looking at polity, it made me think of a paper that I'm currently working on, a working paper on contentious election outcomes. And I as part of this paper, was looking at how the different one of the articles that I was looking at failed democratization. It was a book, Failed Democratization, Why Some Countries Don't Become More Democratic. And they talk about preference and support for democracy over time, but they didn't really differentiate the survey respondents according to some characteristics that I think were relevant for whether people are more likely or less likely to support democracy. An obvious one that I looked at just in the data that I'm putting here is by gender. And the book was looking at a Guatemalan case, and you can see in the bars above that men are much more likely to prefer democracy than women in almost all cases, I think, except for there's a statistically significant difference in all cases except for 1997, I believe, 1998. That men are much more likely to prefer democracy in that one case. And if you look at all Latin American cases, it's much clearer that there is a difference in the views and support for democracy just across genders. But you could think of a lot of different identity groups, socioeconomic groups that would be having different preferences for what institutionalized democracy means to them and how they might want to see it actually carried out. So I thought it was, given that the ANU is a research-led university, I thought I would try to link this kind of discussion of political systems to something that I'm working on ongoing. When I'm done with these videos, I'm going to send this article back out as a conditional acceptance. A lot of these democratic issues and contentious elections. Hungary just had one, Belarus The United States is going to have one in November. Australia had one last year. The research on democratization, democratic protests, election violence, other contentious issues, the interest in this has grown over time because I think people are understanding that the period between the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War had this kind of stasis in which you had one side advocating democracy and one side not. Then there was a push towards expanding democratization in the 1990s. Now we see 14 years of a gradual backslide of democracy. So these democratic institutions that we're looking at are not without question now in 2020. One of the alternatives are systems that don't have those institutional balance of powers, focus on constitution's rule of law, or individual participation in democratic systems. Autocratic systems would be the opposite of democratic systems in the other extreme of those polity measures. Barbara Geddes and Jose Chibub and a bunch of others have looked at what makes a system an autocracy as opposed to a democracy. Barbara Geddes had a typology that's quite influential. She groups autocracies into military systems, party-based systems, personalist systems, systems that are based around one individual leader. I think Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein would be clear examples of this, or monarchies. It's also based in the individual, but it's less coming through power through coups or through military force, but through heredity, right? These are different ways of having autocratic regimes. For the monarchy, I think Saudi Arabia would be an example of that, just keeping with the Middle East. How do we look at institutionalized autocracies, opposite of democracies? You see a lot of similar factors, just at different levels. Constraints on the chief executive are slight to moderate. They aren't through elections. Openness of executive recruitment are either closed or designated. And competitiveness of participation is either repressed or suppressed, right? So you have these general questions, but you have different values for these different variables. And so these would be institutionalized autocracies, the ones that have these values that don't match onto the democratic institutions we've already covered. In general, in generating the polity score, which is a 21-point score that goes from -10 to 10, what they do is they look at these sub-indicators, they add together those different weights, as you saw in the slides, and then just subtract the autocratic characteristics from the democratic, which leaves the aggregate score. Hopefully this reminds you of the cost-benefit analysis calculation in the Collier and Hoffler 1998 piece, in which you have costs and benefits. This is also just a basic simple equation that you have positive characteristics that are democratic from a normatively democratic perspective, and the autocratic ones that go against that. Okay. There's a lot of different ways to kind of conceptualize it. And just looking at a couple of trends given this definition, you see the dotted line here in this graph from the polity, the Center for Systemic Peace, that codes democracies and autocracies, that the blue line is democracies. Those have escalated quite quickly, grown quite quickly since the end of the Cold War. Autocracies in red have declined, and those anocracies, ones that have mixed systems, that have some democratic characteristics and some autocratic, have become also more common than autocracies since the end of the Cold War. We're going to be talking about more about autocracies in a minute. Polity is not the only measure. The Freedom House, they have a freedom in the world map I showed back in week 1. They categorize states as being free, partly free, or not free. Their categorization, the 3 categories instead of 21, are based on sub-indices, as a lot of these are. Theirs are focused on political rights and civil liberties, how well those are respected within different states. A third that we're going to be focusing on in this class is one of the newest and the most exciting, definitely the largest project in trying to understand democracy, the Varieties of Democracy project based in Sweden. They just came out with a book delving into their conceptualizations of democracy in a lot more detail. It's a big book. I would encourage you to take a look at it if you're interested. But they conceptualize democracy as having an election core surrounded by 6 separate other characteristics: electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberative, and egalitarian. So the first one, rulers are responsible to the citizens through competition, through periodic elections. Liberal democracy, one that's separate from how we would conceptualize liberal now, but putting an intrinsic value on protecting individual and minority rights against potential tyranny. Because in systems in which you have elections, you're going to have winner and votes, you're going to have winners and losers. And in these systems, this broader conceptualization of democracy says it's not just enough to have elections, you actually have protections against those who lose the elections, so they have a chance to also get benefits or be able to win elections next time. Direct participation, we've already covered earlier. Deliberation, dialogue is a fundamental process in democracies. You need to be able to, through discussion, figure out what interests are, what the needs are in order to make policies that are appropriate to it. And egalitarian issues, material and immaterial inequalities, help inhibit the use of formal rights and formal liberties. So you have political rights, civil rights, and economic rights, right? Reducing those kind of dramatic inequalities within a society. Some advocate the egalitarian interests in being a fundamental point of democracy. Just as a side note, these things can be quite abstract. Like Gapminder, which we saw last week, you can go to the Varieties of Democracy website and visualize the correlations between different sub-indices of democracy, as well as a bunch of other different factors on their website. It's a way to kind of while away some time and to see how different countries have fared according to these election measures, as well as some indices.